Hallo mensen, welkom vandaag deze live. Vandaag gaan we hoe je weet hoe dingen spelen. Toen kwam de business. Attends, mensen. Ik moet iets van live sturen naar mijn vriend. Toen kon de business. Toen kan ik kijken als de camera kan zetten of niet. Ik moet iets van live sturen naar mijn vriend. Toen kon de business. Toen kan ik kijken als de camera kan zetten of niet. Eerst camera tonen. Oh, kan ik je camera tonen of zo? Camera. Eerst camera tonen. Oh, kan ik je camera tonen of zo? Camera. Ga delen. Delen. Yo mensen, goedemorgen iedereen. Of het is avond vergeten. Met een job tussen van nu. Oké. Ah. Yo mensen, goedemorgen iedereen. Of het is avond vergeten. Met een job tussen. Oké mensen. Bref mensen. Vandaag ga ik gelukkig zijn. J'avoue, wacht hè. Attends, ik kan dit zien. Attends. Chat is disabled voor this livestream staat er. Ik ga dat even moeten fixen hè. Fix je dat. Chat staat hier. Chat is disabled voor this livestream. Is deze livestream kapot?
Ik denk dat dat ook werkt zonder de AC. Dus e-mail is normaal gezien dat je daarom gaat pauze wordt. Ja, niet de helft aangesteld tijdens de pauze. Tussen de 2 uur en kookcollege. Als we zouden naar code rood gaan, of als het niet meer mogelijk zou zijn om campus les te geven, dan zal ik ervoor zorgen dat er geen canvas momenten zijn waar jullie vragen kunnen stellen.
Ja mensen. Dit is mijn eerste live of wacht je beste live ter wereld. Ha. Zo. Nou voorbij, nou. Goed mensen, ik film me, dus we gaan even wat erbij liggen. Ah hier, dus ik moet naar de stream gaan. Dus ik ga op YouTube. Ik ben toch een man op kans. Waar is de studio YouTube? Ik ben toch al live, dus ja. Niet vergeten mensen, like, abonneer. Maar spijt me nog, zie ik jullie chat niet. J'avoue, on de jeu. Normaal, ik ga niet liegen, ik wil best wel jullie chat zien, maar je weet hoe het is, Ik ga even wat Roblox spelen, want op welke kant ben ik, dan kan ik het aanpassen. Wees. Ja mensen, ik heb het gevonden, video wachten. Hey, ja, wat gaat het? Ja, even niks zien mensen, want het is even...
De oefeningensessies beginnen voor alle groepen in week 4. Dat is niet volgende week, maar de week erna. De week die begint op maandag 5 oktober. Ik weet dat op de roosters voor de wiskunde en fysica reeds oefeningen stonden gisteren, maar die zijn dus niet doorgegaan omdat er nog niet genoeg theorie, leerstof bezig is.
Ah ja.
Voor alle duidelijk open via de tussendienst van de VUB of de nota die je ook kan downloaden in PDF op Canvas in de rubriek bestanden. Dat is om geen verwarring te scheppen, omdat de video's die ik maak misschien niet exact hetzelfde zeggen als wat ik in de les geef. Misschien dat ik dingen zeg in de les die niet in de video staan en zo, of die in de video staan niet in de les. Dus om altijd zeggen als wat ik in de les geef. Misschien dat ik dingen zeg in de les die niet in de video staan en zo, of die in de video staan niet in de les. Dus om alles duidelijk te houden wat in de cursusnota staat, moeten jullie kennen voor het examen. Daar zijn ook beaan niet in de les. Dus om alles duidelijk te geven, misschien dat ik dingen zeg in de les die niet in de video staan en zo, of die in de video staan niet in de les. Dus om alles duidelijk te houden wat in de cursusnota staat, moeten jullie kennen voor het examen. Die in de video staan niet in de les. Dus om alles duidelijk te houden wat in de cursusnota staat, moeten jullie kennen voor het examen. Daar zijn ook bewijzen bij. De bewijzen moeten ook allemaal gekend zijn. Goed, maar ja, je ziet van hebben, ik zal zeker 99% van wat in de nota staat ook in de les en in de video's.
Hallo is er.
Goed, laat ons kijken. Wat is lineaire
Ze hebben
algebra? Waarvoor is lineaire algebra?
Ah, maar nee, ik heb mijn scherm uitgezet, want ik ben met parameter gaan doen.
Dus het idee van lineaire algebra is dat we eigenlijk wiskunde gaan doen, maar wat je dan eigenlijk doet, dat we eigenlijk wiskunde niet nodig hebben. Alles zal vertaald worden naar algebra.
Ja.
En algebra is
Maar zo,
rekenkunde, laat ons zeggen. En daar
maar er is een probleem.
ja, berekeningen, in bijzondere wiskundige structuren. De weetkunde,
Ze kunnen geen chats doen.
weetkundig of ruimtelijk inzicht hebben of even, wel via de lineaire algebra.
Je me demande ça aussi, hein.
Ah, maar je hebt dat ding op kind gezet.
Mocht dat niet?
Je hebt gedaan dat de lijst voor kinderen is.
Oh, de oogst.
Ah, dus moet dat niet.
Een ander punt.
Nee, je doet dat niet voor kinderen.
Ah, opslaan. Wat is je veel?
Vormen die 3 punten als die in algemene ligging
Mooi bediening heb je gemaakt.
Fiets op CapCut.
Dan vormen die een basis. En dan de woorden
Ja.
de rechten door O en E.
Dus dat is gefixt, hè.
Dat zal dan misschien de x-as zijn.
Hallo mensen.
En je gaat E beschouwen als 1.
Waar is het normaal?
Dan ga je beschouwen als 0 op die as. En dan ga je ook de rechten door de punt beschouwen. Dat zal
Wat?
zijn en
Moet je
het
ook live.
Ja, ik kan live, ik kan live. Ja, mag live. Wacht, ik heb even mijn scherm tonen. Ja, ik kan er bij links opstarten. En kijk als je kan chatten nu.
Jongen! Mensen, abonneer op mij, weet. En respecteer deze man, want deze man, hij gaat veel doen voor jullie. Voor mij is hij een van de beste.
How to resolve injustice, I want you to first think about an error, and specifically, think about that error inside a coordinate system, like the XY, which is still a thing of words. This is a little bit different from the physics student perspective, where vectors continue since early on. In linear algebra, it's always the case that your vector will be rooted at the origin. Then, once you understand the new concept in the context of errors in space, we'll translate it over to the list of numbers points, which we can do by considering the coordinate number.
Ja, je
Now,
doet.
while I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with this coordinate system, it's worth walking through explicitly, since this is where all of the important back and forth happens between the two perspectives of linear algebra. Focusing our attention on two dimensions, it happens between the two perspectives of linear algebra. Focusing our attention on two dimensions for a moment, you have a horizontal line called the x-axis and a vertical line.
Ja, ik weet, maar dat is job. Hij
The
zit
place
er.
where they intersect is called the origin, which you should think of as the center of space and the root of all vectors. After choosing an arbitrary length to represent one, you may tick marks on each axis to represent this distance. When I want to convey the idea of 2D space as a whole, which you'll see comes up a lot in these videos, I'll extend these tick marks to make grid lines. But right now, they'll actually get a little bit in the way. The coordinates of a vector is a pair of numbers that basically gives instructions for how to get from the tail of that vector at the origin to its tip.
Nu kan ik chat kijken nu. Stuur eens een bericht.
Positive numbers indicating rightward motion, negative numbers indicating
Stuur nog eens.
and the second number tells you how far to walk parallel to the y-axis after that. Positive numbers indicating upward motion, and negative numbers indicating downward motion.
Dat bekeert niet, bro. Ik ben serieus.
The convention is to write this pair of numbers vertically.
Frère, ik ben aan mijn af aan kijken, dat heb ik pas.
Every pair of numbers gives you one and only one vector. And every
Omdat ik blijf staan. Oh.
with one and only one pair of numbers.
Maar bro, ik blijf staan. Ik ben niet aan bezig.
We
Oh.
had a third axis, called the z-axis, which is perpendicular to both the x and y-axes. And in this case, each vector is associated with an ordered triplet of numbers. The first tells you how far to move
Ah, ik kan
along
dat zien.
the
Ik kan de
x-axis.
tekst zien.
The second tells you how far to move parallel to the y-axis. And the third one tells you how far to then move parallel to the
Ja, ik doe ze aan mij gelijk. Ik heb die.
Every triplet of numbers gives you one unique vector.
Hallo mensen. Ja, ja.
Every vector of
Yo,
space gives you
oké.
exactly one
Hij zegt
triplet.
iets.
So back to vector addition.
Hij zegt iets aan vandaag. Ik zie het.
After all, every topic in linear algebra
If
is
you go
going
on,
to
boy,
center
like
around
me.
these two operations.
Ah, ik heb update of
It's
zo.
straightforward to define.
Ik ga proberen
Let's say
even
you
te
have
opstarten
two
op
vectors,
GeForce.
one pointing up and a little to the right, and the other one pointing right and down a bit. To add these two vectors, move the second one so that its tail sits at the tip of the first one. Then, if you draw a new vector from the tail of the first one to where the tip of the second one now sits, that new vector is their sum.
Wat?
This definition of addition, by the way, is pretty
Was
much
that
the only time in linear algebra where we
Okay.
let vectors stray away from the origin. Now, why is this a reasonable thing to do? Why this definition of addition and not some other one? Well, the way I like to think about it is that each vector represents a certain movement, a step with a certain distance and direction in space. If you take a step along the first vector, then take a step in the direction and distance described by the second vector, the overall effect is just the same as if you moved along the sum of those two vectors to start with. You could think about this as an extension of how we think about adding numbers on a number line. One way that we teach kids to think about this, say with 2 plus 5, is to think of moving 2 steps to the right, followed by another 5 steps to the right. The overall effect is the same as if you just took 7 steps to the right. In fact, let's see how vector addition
Eigenlijk kun
works
je... je kan
numerically.
geen chess zien.
The first vector here has coordinates 1, 2. And the
Je
second
hebt
one
alleen
has
maar
coordinates
yo,
3,
yo, yo.
1.
Ja.
When you take the vector
Yeah.
sum using this tip to tail method, you can think of a
What's
4-step
up?
path from the origin to the tip of the second vector. Walk 1 to the right, then 2 up, then 3 to the right, then 1 down.
Wat?
Reorganizing these steps so that you first do all of the rightward motion, then do all the vertical motion, you can
Okay.
do the same. First move 1 plus 3 to the right, then
Welke
move
locatie?
2 minus 1 up. So the new vector has coordinates 1 plus 3 and 2 plus negative 1. In general, if you take the number 2 and multiply it by a given vector,
Wat was
it means you
gebeurd? Oh.
stretch out that vector so that it's 2 times as long as when you started. If you multiply that vector by, say, 1/3, it means you squish it down so that it's 1/3 the original length. When you multiply it by a negative number, like negative 1.8, then the vector first gets flipped around, then stretched out by that factor of 1.8. This process of stretching or squishing or sometimes reversing the direction of the vector is called scaling. And whenever you catch a number, like 2 or 1/3 or negative 1.8, acting like this, scaling some vector, you call it a scalar. In fact, throughout the algebra, one of the main things that numbers do
Is
is
mijn
scale numbers.
Airbalix aan
There's time to
eigenlijk?
use the word scalar
Ah,
interchangeably
oké.
in any number. Numerically, stretching out a vector by a factor of, say, 2 corresponds with multiplying
What?
each of its components by that factor, 2. So in the conception of vectors as lists of numbers, multiplying a given vector by a scalar
Yeah,
means
good.
multiplying each one of those components by that scalar. You'll see the kind of what I
No.
mean when I say that linear algebra topics tend to revolve around these two fundamental operations, vector addition and scalar multiplication. And I'll talk more in the last video about how and why the math notation thinks only about these operations, independent and abstracted away from how
What?
you choose to represent vectors. In truth, it doesn't matter whether you think about vectors as
What's
fundamentally
little?
numbers in space, like I'm suggesting you do, that happen to have a nice numerical representation, or fundamentally as listed numbers that happen to have a nice
What's
numerical
that?
representation. The usefulness of linear algebra has less to do with either one of these views than it does with the ability to translate back and forth
Ah,
between
maar
them.
nee, nee,
It
nee.
is
Ik
the
ben
data analyst
zo...
who nicely conceptualize
Ja,
the
checken. Ik kan kijken
where
hoor.
data
Mensen sturen en
can
zo.
seriously clarify patterns in data and give a global view of what certain operations do. And on the flip side, because people like physicists and computer graphics programmers a language to describe space and the manipulation of space using numbers that can text and run through a computer. When I do mapping animations, for example, I start with
Ik
thinking
kan
about
het niet, dat is het probleem. Dus je voor de lichten
computer can
aanhouden.
represent things numerically, thereby figuring out where to place the pixels on the screen. And doing that usually relies on a lot of linear algebra understanding. So there are your vector basics, and in the next video, I'll start getting into some pretty neat concepts surrounding vectors, like span, bases, and linear dependence. See you then. In the last video, along with the ideas of vector addition and scalar multiplication, I described vector coordinates, where there's this back and forth between, for example,
Dus hoe doe je alweer een video op Google?
Now, I imagine the vector coordinates were already familiar to a lot of you, but there's another kind of interesting way to think about these coordinates, which is pretty simple for linear algebra. When you have a pair of numbers that's meant to describe a vector, like 3, negative 2, I want you to think about each coordinate as a scalar, meaning think about how each one stretches or squishes vectors. In the xy coordinate system, there are two very special vectors. The one pointing to the right with length 1, commonly called I hat, or I want you to think about equal to linear algebra. When you have a pair of numbers that's meant to describe a vector, like 3, negative 2, I want you to think about each coordinate as a scalar.
Dus hoe doe je alweer GeForce op Google? Hoe doe je alweer GeForce op Google?
Meaning, think about these coordinates, which is pretty simple for linear algebra. When you have
Hoe
a
doe je
pair of
dat?
numbers that's meant to describe a vector, like 3, negative 2, I want you to think about each
Meneer, hoe
coordinate
doe je
as a
dat?
scalar.
Ah,
Meaning, think about how each one stretches or squishes
j'ai
vectors.
déjà fait.
In the xy coordinate system, there are two very special vectors. The one pointing to the right with length 1, commonly called I hat, or the unit vector in the x direction, and the one pointing straight up with length 1, commonly called j hat, or the unit vector in the y direction. Now, think of the x-coordinate of our vector as a scalar that scales I hat, stretching it by a factor of 2, and the y-coordinate as a scalar that scales j hat, flipping it and stretching it by a factor of 2. In this sense, the vector that these coordinates describe is the sum of two scale vectors. That's a surprisingly important concept, this idea of adding together two scale vectors. Those two vectors, I
Yeah,
hat and
what's
j
up?
hat, have a special name, by the way. Together, they're called the basis of a coordinate system.
What?
What this means, basically, is that when you think about
Wat zeg
coordinates as
je?
scalars, the basis vectors are what those scalars actually,
Hoe doe je bij GeForce op, op
also a technical
Google?
definition, but I'll get to that later. By showing our coordinate system in terms of these two special basis vectors, it raises a pretty interesting and subtle point. We could have chosen different basis vectors and gotten a completely reasonable new
Ik doe dat
coordinate
sinds het begin,
system.
dat werkt
For
niet.
example, pick some vector pointing up and
Ik
to
doe
the
dat
right,
sinds het
along with
begin, dat
another
werkt
vector
niet.
pointing down and to the right in some way. Take a moment to think about all the different vectors that you
Dat
can
is
get
moeilijk.
by choosing two scalars, using each one
Dat is
to
moeilijk.
scale one of the vectors, then adding together what you get.
Ja,
Which
werkt
two-dimensional
niet.
vectors can you reach by altering the choices of scalars? The answer is that you
Moet
can
ik
reach
op Join
every
Now
possible
schrijven?
two-dimensional vector. And I think it's a good
Moet ik
problem
op
to
Join Now
contemplate
schrijven? Ik klik
that. A
op.
new pair of
Moet ik
basis
op
vector
Join Now
still
klikken?
gives us a valid way to go back and forth between pairs of numbers and two-dimensional vectors. But the association is definitely different from the one that you get using
Ah,
the
ik
more
ga gewoon op
standard basis like
app.
I hat and j hat. This is something I'll go into
Laisse
much more
tomber, laisse
detail on
tomber.
later, describing the exact relationship between
Laisse
different
tomber.
coordinate systems. But for right now, I just want you to appreciate
Laisse
the fact that
tomber.
anytime we describe vectors numerically, it depends on an implicit choice of what basis vector we use.
Ik ga op via app.
So anytime that you're scaling two vectors and adding them like this,
Ga
it's
via
called
app.
a linear combination of those two vectors.
Ja, de application.
Then like this, it's called a linear combination of those two vectors. Where does this word linear come from? Why does this have anything to do with lines? Well, this isn't the etymology, but one way I like to think about it is that if you fix one of those scalars and let the other one change its value freely, the tip of the resulting vector draws a straight line. Now, if you let both scalars change freely, but one way I like to think about it is that if you fix one of those scalars and let the other one change its value freely, the tip of the resulting vector draws a straight line. Now, if you let both scalars change
Ik ben
freely
aan het kijken
and
voor mijn
consider
live.
every possible vector that you can get, there are two things
Bro, ik ben aan het kijken naar mijn live, wees.
For most pairs of vectors, you'll be able to reach every possible point in the plane. Every two-dimensional vector is within your grasp. However, in the unlucky case where your two original vectors
Dan
happen
wacht
to line
even.
up, the tip of the resulting vector is limited to just this single line passing through the origin. Actually, technically there's a third possibility
Non,
too.
non, je coupe,
Both
je
your
coupe, je
vectors could
coupe.
be zero, in which case you'd just be stuck at the origin.
Non, non, tu déranges un peu là.
Here's some
Ouais.
more terminology. The set of all possible vectors that you can reach with a linear combination of a given pair of vectors is called the span
Non, non, non,
of
non,
those
je
two
t'ai
vectors.
averti.
So restating what we
Yeah,
just
yeah.
saw in this lingo, the span of most pairs of 2D vectors is all vectors of 2D space. But when they line up, their span is all vectors whose tip sit on a certain line. Remember how I said that linear algebra revolves around vector addition and scalar multiplication? Well, the span of two vectors is basically a way of asking what are all the possible vectors you can reach using
Yeah,
only
what's up?
these two fundamental operations, vector addition and scalar multiplication.
Hmm?
This is a good time to talk about how people commonly think about vectors as points. It gets really crowded to think about a
Bro,
whole
je hebt op
collection of
me.
vectors
Wees.
sitting on a line.
Je
And
hebt
more
op
crowded
me.
still to think about all two-dimensional
Je
vectors
hebt
all
op
at
me
once,
letterlijk, bro.
filling
Ik
up
ben
the
live, je
point.
hebt op me.
So when dealing with collections of vectors like this, it's common to represent each one with just a point in space. The point at the tip of that vector, where, as usual, I want you thinking about that vector with its tail on the origin. That way, if you want to think about every possible vector whose tip sits on a certain line, just think about the line itself. Likewise, to think about all possible two-dimensional vectors all at once, conceptualize each one as the point where its tip sits.
Ouais, maar
So,
zo.
in effect, what you'll be thinking about is the infinite
Wees.
flat sheet of
Wees.
two-dimensional space itself, leaving the arrows out of it. In general, if you're thinking about a vector on its own, think of it as an arrow.
Ja, mensen, ik ga even
And if you're
wat
dealing with
aanwijdig
a collection
spelen.
of vectors, it's convenient to think of them all as points. So for our span example, the span of most pairs of vectors ends up being the entire infinite sheet of two-dimensional space. But if they line up, their span is just a line. The idea of span gets a lot more interesting if we start thinking about vectors in three-dimensional space. For example, if you take two vectors in 3D space that are not pointing in the same direction, what does it mean to take their span? Well, their span is the collection of all possible linear combinations of those two vectors, meaning all possible vectors you get by scaling each of the two of them in some way and then adding them together. You can kind of imagine turning two different knobs to change the two scalars defining the linear combination, adding the scaled vectors and following the tip of the resulting vector. That tip will trace out some kind of flat sheet cutting through the origin of three-dimensional space. About all possible two-dimensional vectors all at once, conceptualize each one as the point where its tip sits. So in effect, what you'll be thinking about is the infinite flat sheet of two-dimensional space itself, leaving the arrows out of it. In general, if you're thinking about a vector on its own, think of it as an arrow. And if you're dealing with a collection of vectors, it's convenient to think of them all as points. So for our span example, the span of most pairs of vectors ends up being the entire infinite sheet of two-dimensional space. But if they line up, their span is just a line. The idea of span gets a lot more interesting if we start thinking about vectors in three-dimensional space. For example, if you take two vectors in 3D space that are not pointing in the same direction, what does it mean to take their span?
Wat, mensen?
Well, their span is the collection of all possible linear combinations of those two vectors, meaning all possible vectors you get by scaling each of the two of them in some way and then adding them together. You can kind of imagine turning two different knobs to change the two scalars defining the linear combination, adding the scaled vectors and following
Bon,
the
mensen,
tip
kijk,
of the
kijk, kijk, kijk.
resulting
Vandaag
vector.
gewoon goed live, je weet toch.
That
Rustig.
tip will trace out some kind of
Roblox
flat
spelletje gewoon,
sheet
hè.
cutting through the origin of three-dimensional space. This flat sheet is the span of the
Ik ben
two
dingen
vectors,
vergeten.
or more precisely,
Zo.
the set of all possible vectors whose
Zo
tips
dingen
sit on
capture
that
te
flat
doen.
sheet is the span of those two
Maar
vectors.
blijkbaar.
Isn't that a beautiful mental image? So what happens if we add a third vector and consider the span of all three of those guys? A linear combination of three vectors is defined pretty much the same way as it is for two. You'll choose three different scalars, scale each of those vectors, and then add them all together. And again, the span of these vectors is the set of all possible linear combinations. Two different things could happen here. If your third vector happens to be sitting on the span of the first two, then the span doesn't change. You're sort of trapped on that same flat sheet. In other words, adding a scaled version of that third vector to the linear combination doesn't really give you access to any new vectors. But if you just randomly choose a third vector, it's almost certainly not sitting on the span of those first two. Then, since it's pointing in a separate direction, it unlocks access to every possible three-dimensional vector.
Keer.
One way I like to think about this is that as you scale that new third vector, it moves around that span sheet of the first two, sweeping it through all of space. Another way to think about it is that you're making full use of the three freely changing scalars that you have at your disposal to access the full three dimensions of space. Now, in the case where the third vector was already sitting on the span of the first two, or the case where two vectors happen to line up, we want some terminology to describe the fact that at least one of these vectors is redundant, not adding anything to our span. Whenever this happens, where you have multiple vectors and you could remove one without reducing the span, the relevant terminology is to say that they are linearly dependent. Another way of phrasing that
Mensen, ik heb
would
vandaag
be to say that one
dingen
of the
opstarten.
vectors can be expressed as
GeForce
a linear
Experience.
combination of the others, since it's already in the span of the others. On the other hand, if each vector really does add another dimension to the span, they're said to be linearly independent. So, span. On the other hand, if each vector really does add another dimension to the span, they're said to be linearly independent. So with all of that terminology, and hopefully with some good mental images to go with it, let me leave you with a puzzle before we go. The technical definition of a basis of a space is a set of linearly independent vectors that span that space. Now, given how I described a basis earlier, and given your current understanding of the words span and linearly independent, think about why this definition would make sense. In the next video, this is a set of linearly
Bon, mensen,
independent
ik heb iets voor een
vectors
liedje zetten
that
om de
span
dingen te
that
hypen.
space.
Parce que mijn
Now,
broers en
given how I
dingen, dat is
described the
irritant.
basis earlier, and given your current understanding
Schaffen.
of the words span and linearly independent, think about why this definition would make sense.
Job.
In the next video, I'll
Job,
get
je hebt toch
into
geen examens?
matrices and transforming space. See you then.
Job. Je hebt toch geen examens? Job.
Hey everyone. If I had to choose just one topic that makes all of the others in linear algebra start to click, and which too often goes unnamed the first time a student takes linear algebra, it would be this one. The idea of a linear transformation and its relation to matrices. For this video, I'm just going to focus on what these transformations look like in the case of two dimensions, and how they relate to the idea of matrix vector multiplication. In particular, I want to show you a way to think about matrix vector multiplication that doesn't rely on memorization. To start, let's just parse this term, linear transformation. Transformation is essentially a fancy word for function. It's something that takes in inputs and spits out an output for each one. Specifically, in the context of linear algebra, we like to think about transformations that take in some vector and spit out another vector. So why use the word transformation instead of function if they mean the same thing? Well, it's to be suggestive of a certain way to visualize this input-output relation. You see, a great way to understand functions of vectors is to use movement. If a transformation takes some input vector to some output vector, we imagine that input vector moving over to the output.
Mensen, ik heb een glitch dat ik Roblox arbeidig niet kan spelen.
As a whole, we might imagine watching every possible input vector move over to its corresponding output vector. It gets really crowded to think about all of the vectors all at once, each one is an arrow. So, as I mentioned last video, a nice trick is to conceptualize each vector not as an arrow, but as a single point where it sits. That way, to think about a transformation taking every possible input vector to some output vector, we watch every point in space moving to some other point. In the case of transformations in two dimensions,
c'est pour ça, ik weet niet wat het is. Ik had settings denk ik gezet.
I like to do this with all of the points on an infinite grid. I also sometimes like to keep a copy of the grid in the background, just to help keep track of where everything ends up and where it starts. The effect of various transformations moving around all of the points in space is, you gotta admit, beautiful. It gives the feeling of squishing and morphing space itself. As you can imagine, though, arbitrary transformations can look pretty complicated. But luckily, linear algebra limits itself to a special type of transformation, ones that are easier to understand, called linear transformations.
Yeah, ouais, sœur.
Visually speaking, a transformation is linear if it has two properties. All lines must remain lines without getting curved, and the origin must remain fixed in place. For example, this right here would not be a linear transformation, since the lines get all curvy. And this one right here, although it keeps the line straight, is not a linear transformation, because it moves the origin. This one here fixes the origin, and it might look like it keeps lines straight, but that's just because I'm only showing the horizontal and vertical grid lines. When you see what it does to a diagonal line, it becomes clear that it's not at all linear, since it turns that line all curvy. In general, you should think of linear transformations as keeping grid lines parallel and evenly spaced. Some linear transformations are simple to think about, like rotations about the origin. Others are a little trickier to describe with words. So how do you think you could describe these transformations numerically? If you were, say, programming some animations to make a video teaching the topic, what formula do you give the computer so that if you give it the coordinates of a vector,
Nouveauté sur iOS 17. AirDrop 2.0 permet de partager rapidement ses informations de contact en rapprochant son iPhone à celui d'un autre. Nouveauté sur iOS 10. Ah, depuis que j'ai l'argent, c'est comme ça, bien zéro souci. Viens faire un tour dans le train, faut pas t'attendre là-bas des bougies. Plus qu'à t'attendre. Des fonctionnalités qui
iOS 17 est sorti et on va faire un petit récap de toutes les nouveautés importantes. Déjà, première nouveauté incroyable, c'est la...
Ah, mensen eindelijk.
Nouveauté sur iOS 10. Je viens. Et regarde. Ok. Attends, on va. Stop. iOS 17. Je viens. Et regarde. Name drop. With name drop, you can.
Mensen, kan liggen. Ik ben een beetje moe. Dus. Ja, precies. Wees. Enfin. Ouais, enfin les gars, on peut jouer, c'est sûr. Wesh, là ça va pas bugger. Hein. Enfin, parce que là j'ai ma high performance. Ouais, je trouve que ça, c'est le problème, c'est que si ça se ferme. Bref, on s'en fout de ça. Ok. Qu'est-ce que je veux comme ça? Ja mensen, we gaan jullie terugspelen. Even kijken de live. Ja mensen, we gaan jullie terugspelen. Even kijken de live. Ja mensen, we gaan jullie terugspelen. Even kijken de live. Ja.